Scene opens with visuals of quiet, late autumn landscapes. Leaves falling in slow motion, a misty morning in a forest, golden fields after harvest. Hello, and welcome. Can you feel it? There's a certain quiet that descends with November. It's a whisper carried on the wind, rustling through the last of the fallen leaves. The air grows crisp, carrying the earthy scent of the harvest. A sense of closure as the land prepares for its long winter sleep. It's a time for reflection, for gathering close, and for stories. And there is no story more woven into the fabric of this month than that of Thanksgiving. We all know the picture. Pilgrims and Native Americans sharing a peaceful feast, a moment of harmony in a fledgling world. It's an image that has been painted in our minds since childhood, a cornerstone of American identity. But stories, especially those told over centuries, have a way of changing. They get smoothed over, simplified, and sometimes the most important details are lost in the retelling. The story of Thanksgiving is far more complex and fascinating than the simple scene we often imagine. It's a tale that begins not with a grand declaration, but with a single, 3-day harvest festival in 1621. A moment in time. So how did that one event, nearly forgotten for centuries, transform into the national holiday we celebrate today? How did it become this symbol of national unity and gratitude? The journey from that singular feast to our modern Thanksgiving is a long and winding road, filled with political maneuvering, cultural shifts, and a woman whose pen was mightier than any presidential decree. It's a story of survival, of cautious diplomacy, and of a misunderstanding that has echoed through 400 years of history. To truly understand Thanksgiving, we have to travel back. We need to strip away the layers of myth and misconception and look at the world as it was in 1621. A world of uncertainty for a small group of English settlers, known to us as the Pilgrims, who were clinging to a precarious existence on the edge of a continent they barely understood, and a world of profound change for the Wampanoag people, the people of the First Light, who had inhabited these lands for more than 12,000 years and were now facing the arrival of a strange new culture. So, let us start at the very beginning and ask the question that lies at the heart of it all. What really happened between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag on that day? What brought these two vastly different groups together for that legendary meal? Was it a planned celebration of friendship, or was it something else entirely? Join me as we uncover the true story behind the first Thanksgiving. Before we dive in, if you enjoy exploring the hidden corners of history, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you won't miss what is coming next. Now, let's step back in time. Our story begins not in the golden light of autumn, but in the brutal, unforgiving cold of the previous winter, when the Mayflower anchored in what is now Provincetown Harbor in November 1620. Its 102 passengers were not stepping into a promised land. They were stepping into a trial by fire, or rather, by ice. They were ill-prepared for the harshness of a New England winter. They had arrived too late to plant crops. Their supplies were dwindling, and they were weakened by the long, arduous journey across the Atlantic. The place they chose to settle, a village they named Plymouth, was built upon a tragedy. It was the site of a former Wampanoag village called Patuxet, which had been wiped out by a devastating plague just a few years earlier. The Pilgrims found cleared fields, a convenient freshwater spring, and the silent, haunting graves of the people who had lived there before. For the Pilgrims, they saw it as a sign of divine providence. For the Wampanoag, it was a ghost land, a place of immense sorrow. This is a critical piece of the puzzle. The Pilgrims didn't arrive in a wilderness. They arrived in a land shaped and managed by native hands for millennia, a land now scarred by disease that had swept ahead of them. That first winter was catastrophic. Scurvy, pneumonia, and sheer starvation ran rampant through the small community huddled in their hastily built shelters. By the time spring arrived, nearly half of the Mayflower's original passengers were dead. The survivors were weak, frightened, and desperate. They were on the brink of complete failure. From the woods, the Wampanoag, led by their Sachem, or Chief Massasoit. Why didn't they simply attack and wipe out these weakened intruders? To understand Massasoit's decision, we have to understand his own precarious position. The plague that had emptied Patuxet had also decimated his people, weakening the Wampanoag Confederacy and leaving them vulnerable to their rivals, the powerful Narragansett tribe to the west. Massasoit saw these strange English newcomers, with their powerful muskets, not just as a threat, but as a potential and powerful ally. He needed to be cautious. In March of 1621, the first steps toward an uneasy alliance were taken. A lone Abenaki man named Samoset, who had learned some English from fishermen, strode boldly into the Plymouth settlement and greeted them in their own language. A few days later, he returned with a man whose story is absolutely central to the survival of the Pilgrims. Tisquanam, or Squanto, as he is famously known. Squanto's life story is almost unbelievable. He was a native of Patuxet, the very village where the Pilgrims now lived. Years before, he had been kidnapped by an English explorer, taken to Spain, sold into servitude, lived in London, and finally, after years of struggle, managed to make his way back home, only to find his entire village, his family, everyone he had ever known, gone. He was the last of the Patuxet. Imagine his position. He was a man without a people, living amongst the ghosts of his past, now faced with a new group of English people settling on his ancestral land. Yet, it was Squanto who bridged the gap. He became the Pilgrims' interpreter and their teacher. He taught them how to plant corn using fish as fertilizer, where to catch fish and eels, and how to identify edible plants. Without Squanto's help, it is almost certain that the remaining Pilgrims would not have survived. He was, for them, an instrument of God. For Massasoit, he was a crucial link to these potential allies. Thanks to Squanto's guidance and a surprisingly mild summer, the Pilgrims' first harvest in the fall of 1621 was a success. They had corn, beans, and squash. They had managed to build more stable homes. They had survived. Governor William Bradford declared a day of celebration to give thanks for their bounty and their survival. This is the moment we're all familiar with. Bradford sent 4 men out, fowling to hunt for birds for the feast. But what happened next is where the popular myth begins to diverge sharply from the historical record. According to the only first-hand account we have, written by a pilgrim named Edward Winslow Massasoit, the Wampanoag leader suddenly appeared at their settlement with 90% of his men. 90 men. That's nearly double the number of Pilgrim men, women, and children combined. This was not a friendly, pre-planned potluck. For the Pilgrims, the sudden arrival of such a large, armed party would have been terrifying. It was a tense moment. Was this an attack? A show of force? Winslow's account is very brief, but it suggests the Wampanoag were not invited guests in the way we think. They likely heard the celebratory gunfire from the Pilgrims' fowling and came to investigate, prepared for a fight. Seeing that it was a celebration, not an act of war, Massasoit and his men decided to stay, but they hadn't brought any food for a feast of this size. Recognizing the Pilgrims' limited provisions, Massasoit sent some of his men out, and they returned with 5 deer. So, the Wampanoag weren't just guests, they were major contributors to the meal. For 3 days, the two groups ate and entertained each other. A mix of military drills by the English and traditional dances by the Wampanoag. This was not a cozy family dinner. It was a diplomatic event, a summit. A tense but successful negotiation between two groups who needed each other to survive. The Pilgrims needed the Wampanoag's knowledge of the land and their protection from other tribes. The Wampanoag, under Massasoit, needed the Pilgrims' firepower to secure their position against the Narragansett. The feast was the result of a fragile, temporary, and mutually beneficial political alliance. It was about politics and survival, not just friendship and gratitude. This 3-day festival was a unique event. It wasn't repeated the next year. In fact, the alliance it represented would crumble within a generation, leading to one of the most brutal conflicts in American history, King Philip's War. So how did this one-off, political gathering, largely forgotten for almost 200 years, become the foundational myth of a national holiday? That story involves presidents, a determined magazine editor, and a nation searching for its own soul. And we'll explore that transformation in our next chapter. Thank you so much for joining me on this historical deep dive. If you found this as fascinating as I do, please give this video a like and share with someone who might enjoy it. And don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell so you're ready for Chapter 2. See you next time. Hello, and welcome back to our journey through history. Today, we're stepping aboard one of the most famous ships in the world, the Mayflower. Grab a seat, because we're about to set sail on a voyage that would change the course of a continent. Imagine this. It's September 1620. The salty air of Plymouth, England, is filled with a mix of hope and fear. A small, sturdy cargo ship, the Mayflower, is packed to the brim. On board are 102 passengers, a mix of religious separatists we now call the Pilgrims, and other colonists, all dreaming of a new life, a new beginning in a place they called the New World. But between them and their dream lay 3,000 miles of the vast, unpredictable Atlantic Ocean. This was no luxury cruise. The Mayflower was a cargo ship not designed for people. The passengers were crammed into the 'tween deck, a dark, cold, and damp space with ceilings so low most adults couldn't stand up straight. There was no privacy, no bathrooms, just a bucket. The smell of unwashed bodies, seasickness, and stale air must have been overwhelming. For 66 days, this cramped, creaking wooden vessel was their entire world. Their diet was just as grim. They lived on salted beef, dried fish, and hard biscuits that were often infested with weevils. Fresh water was strictly rationed and quickly became foul. It's no surprise that sickness was rampant. A dreadful disease, likely a mix of scurvy and pneumonia, swept through the ship. The endless rocking and pitching of the vessel in the rough seas made even the simplest tasks a struggle, but the physical hardship was only half the battle. The psychological toll was immense. They were surrounded by the endless, menacing expanse of the ocean. Vicious storms were a constant threat. At one point, a fierce gale cracked one of the ship's main beams. A moment of pure terror. Water poured into the living quarters, soaking their clothes, their bedding, and their spirits. It seemed like the ship might break apart and send them all to a watery grave. It was a miracle of ingenuity that they managed to repair the beam using a large iron screw they had brought with them. In these moments of despair, what held them together? Their faith. The Pilgrims were a deeply religious people. They gathered for prayers daily, their voices rising above the howl of the wind and the creak of the ship's timbers. They believed they were on a divine mission, that God had a plan for them. This shared belief was the glue that bonded their small community, giving them the strength to endure the unimaginable. They read from the Geneva Bible, sang psalms, and listened to sermons from their leaders, like William Brewster. This spiritual routine provided structure and hope in a world of chaos. Among the passengers were children, whose laughter and cries would have echoed through the damp corridors. Imagine being a child on that voyage, like 6-year-old Mary Chilton, or the young boys of the Billington family, known for their mischief. For them, the ship was a dangerous, boring playground. Tragedy struck when a young servant boy named William Button died, the only passenger to perish during the sea crossing itself. But in the midst of this loss, there was also new life. Elizabeth Hopkins gave birth to a baby boy during the voyage. They named him Oceanus. His birth was a powerful symbol of hope, a sign that life could flourish even in the harshest of conditions. After more than 2 grueling months at sea, their supplies dwindling and their bodies weak, the cry finally came from the lookout. Land. Ho! On November 9th, 1620, the weary travelers caught their first glimpse of the New World. It wasn't their intended destination of Virginia, but the wind-swept shores of what we now call Cape Cod, Massachusetts. The sight of land must have brought an incredible wave of relief. They had made it. They had crossed the unforgiving Atlantic. As the Mayflower dropped anchor in the calm waters of what is now Provincetown Harbor, the passengers could finally breathe. The 66-day ordeal was over, but as they looked out at the wild, unfamiliar coastline, they knew their journey was far from finished. A new, and perhaps even greater, challenge lay ahead, surviving the harsh New England winter and building a new society from scratch in a vast, unknown wilderness. Their epic voyage was complete, but their American story was just beginning. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible voyage across the Atlantic. It's a powerful reminder of the resilience and determination of the human spirit. If you enjoyed this journey back in time, please give this video a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter. We'd love to have you with us as we continue to explore the past. Thanks for watching, and see you next time. Hello history lovers, and welcome back to our series on the Mayflower Pilgrims. In our last chapter, we left the settlers aboard the Mayflower, having just signed the historic Mayflower Compact. Today, we step ashore with them into the harsh reality of a new world winter. This is Chapter 3, Landing at Plymouth Rock. After weeks of scouting parties exploring the desolate coastline, a final decision was made. On a bitterly cold day in late December 1620, the first group of pilgrims set foot on land at a place they would name Plymouth, the legendary Plymouth Rock. Whether the actual first stepping stone or simply a symbol, marks the beginning of their new life. But this was no welcoming paradise. They were met with a landscape cloaked in snow, skeletal trees, and an unnerving silence. The air was so cold it stung their lungs with every breath, for the families still huddled on the cramped, foul-smelling Mayflower. The sight of this bleak, frozen shore must have been a crushing blow to their spirits. The promised land looked barren and utterly inhospitable. Their first task was monumental: to build a settlement from scratch in the middle of a brutal New England winter. Men, weary and malnourished from the long voyage, rowed ashore each day to begin the back-breaking work. They felled trees with simple axes, their hands raw and blistered in the freezing temperatures. They attempted to construct a common house, a crude, windowless structure meant to shelter them and store their meager supplies. Progress was agonizingly slow. The ground was frozen solid, making it nearly impossible to dig foundations or even bury their dead. Icy winds and relentless snowstorms frequently forced them back to the ship, each delay a small defeat in their fight for survival. Imagine the sheer physical and mental exhaustion, working all day in the freezing cold only to return to the damp, crowded confines of the Mayflower at night. The first few months were a period of unimaginable suffering, a time that would later be known as the general sickness or starving time. The pilgrims were ill-prepared for the severity of the winter. Their bodies, already weakened by the long sea journey and a diet of salted meat and hardtack, were no match for the diseases that began to ravage the small community. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, made their gums bleed and their teeth fall out. Pneumonia and tuberculosis, likely spread in the close quarters of the ship and the single common house, swept through the group with deadly efficiency. Hunger was a constant, gnawing companion. Their food stores were dangerously low, and with the ground frozen and the wildlife scarce, hunting and foraging yielded almost nothing. The toll was devastating. At the peak of the sickness, only a half-dozen people were well enough to care for the sick and dying. People like Miles Standish and William Brewster worked tirelessly, thatching wood, making fires, and tending to their ailing friends and family with selfless devotion. But it was often a losing battle. The settlement's single street was lined with the graves of the fallen. By the end of that first winter, nearly half of the original 102 passengers were gone. 45 souls who had crossed an ocean in search of a new life found only an early grave. Entire families were wiped out. Husbands lost wives. Parents lost children. The dream of building a new Jerusalem in the wilderness had turned into a desperate struggle to simply stay alive until spring. It's hard for us to truly comprehend the depth of their despair. Every sunrise brought the possibility of another loss. The sounds of coughing and weeping filled the cold air. They were thousands of miles from home, surrounded by an unfamiliar and seemingly hostile wilderness. The threat of attack by the native peoples, whom they had only glimpsed from a distance, added another layer of constant fear. Their faith was tested to its absolute limit. They had believed they were on a divine mission, guided by God's providence. But in the depths of that terrible winter, surrounded by sickness and death, many must have wondered if God had abandoned them completely. Their survival hung by the thinnest of threads. Yet, they endured. They buried their dead, said their prayers, and with a resilience born of deep faith and sheer desperation, they held on, waiting for the thaw, waiting for a sign of hope, and that hope was about to arrive in the most unexpected way possible. Just as the worst of the winter began to recede, a visitor would walk out of the forest and into their lives, changing their fortunes forever. Who was this visitor? And how did this single encounter save the Plymouth Colony from utter collapse? We'll uncover that incredible story in our next chapter. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. If you're finding this history as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. Your support means the world to us. Until next time, stay curious. Video opens with a serene shot of a dense, ancient forest, sunlight filtering through the canopy, transitioning to a view of the New England coastline as it might have looked centuries ago. Hello and welcome back to our journey. In our last chapter, we followed the Pilgrims as they landed on the shores of what they called a new world, but for the land itself, and for the people who had called it home for more than 12,000 years, this was no new world. This was an ancient land, teeming with history, culture, and life. Today, we step away from the small, struggling Plymouth Colony and turn our gaze to the true inhabitants of this region, the Wampanoag Nation. Before the first European sail ever appeared on the horizon, the Wampanoag, the people of the first light, thrived here. Their territory, known as Patuxet, stretched from present-day southeastern Massachusetts all the way to parts of Rhode Island. This wasn't an empty wilderness. It was a carefully managed network of communities, a mosaic of villages, hunting grounds, and sacred sites. They were a sophisticated society with a deep political structure, a rich spiritual life, and an intricate understanding of the world around them. At the head of this powerful confederation of some 69 tribes was the sachem, or chief, a man named Alsamequin, who you might know by his title. Massasoit was a powerful and respected leader, a shrewd diplomat responsible for the well-being of thousands of his people. His home was in a village called Pequenicket, near modern-day Bristol, Rhode Island. From there, he presided over a land that his people had shaped and been shaped by for countless generations. Life for the Wampanoag was woven into the rhythm of the seasons. They were expert farmers, cultivating the Three Sisters corn, beans, and squash, which grew together in a perfect, symbiotic relationship. The corn provided a stalk for the beans to climb. The beans fixed nitrogen in the soil to nourish the other plants, and the broad leaves of the squash shaded the ground, preventing weeds and keeping the soil moist. This wasn't just agriculture. It was a profound lesson in cooperation, a philosophy that extended to their entire community. In the spring and summer, they would move to the coast to fish, gather shellfish, and plant their crops. They would build their homes, called weedas, from cedar saplings and bark. These homes were warm in the winter and cool in the summer, perfectly adapted to the New England climate. In the fall, they harvested their crops and moved inland to their winter communities, hunting deer, turkey, and bear in the forests. Every part of the animal was used. Every gift from the earth was respected. Their relationship with nature wasn't one of dominion, but of balance and reciprocity. They saw the spiritual in everything in the wind, the trees, the animals, the turning of the seasons. They understood that their survival depended on the health of the land, and they lived by a code of gratitude and respect. This was a worldview fundamentally different from that of the Europeans, who saw the land as a commodity, a wilderness to be tamed and owned. For the Wampanoag, you could no more own the land than you could own the air you breathe. But a great and terrible change had already swept through this ancient land, even before the Mayflower arrived. Between 1616 and 1619, a devastating plague, likely brought by earlier European traders and explorers, had ravaged the coastal tribes. This great dying wiped out an estimated 70 to 90% of the Wampanoag population. Entire villages were silenced, their fields left untended. The community at Patuxet, where the Pilgrims would eventually land, was one of the hardest hit, left almost completely abandoned. Imagine the trauma and the grief. Imagine Massasoit, leading his people through this catastrophic loss, trying to hold his nation together. This epidemic didn't just take lives. It shattered their social structure, their political power, and their spiritual world. And it was in the shadow of this immense tragedy that the Pilgrims arrived. The weakened state of the Wampanoag is a critical and often overlooked part of this story. Their decision to later engage with the English was not made from a position of simple curiosity, but from a complex reality of survival, strategic calculation, and the need to rebuild in a world that had been turned upside down. When the Pilgrims looked around and saw cleared fields and empty villages, they saw it as a gift from their God, a divine providence clearing the way for them. They didn't understand they were walking through a graveyard, a land still echoing with loss. This fundamental misunderstanding would set the stage for the complex and ultimately tragic relationship that was to come. The Wampanoag had seen European ships before. They had traded with them, and they had also experienced their violence and duplicity. They were cautious, watchful. For months, they observed the strange newcomers from a distance, trying to understand their intentions. Were they here to trade or to raid? Were they friend or foe? Massasoit faced a difficult choice. To his west, his nation was threatened by their traditional rivals, the powerful Narragansett tribe, who had been largely spared by the plague. An alliance with these newcomers, with their powerful guns, could potentially help restore the balance of power and protect his people. It was a strategic gamble, a choice made by a leader trying to navigate an uncertain and dangerous future. This is the world the Pilgrims entered. Not a blank slate, but a land with a deep history, inhabited by a resilient people grappling with unimaginable loss and facing a precarious future. The story of Thanksgiving, the story of coexistence, is not a simple tale of newfound friendship. It's a story of two cultures, with vastly different worldviews, coming together at a critical moment in history, driven by mutual need and suspicion. As we move forward, we'll explore this first encounter and the fragile alliance that was forged between Massasoit and the Plymouth Colony. It's a story of diplomacy, communication, and a brief period of peace, but it also contains the seeds of future conflict. Thank you so much for joining me today to learn about the people of the First Light. Their story is a vital and necessary part of our shared history. If you found this chapter enlightening, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel so you won't miss what comes next. As always, I love reading your thoughts and questions in the comments below. Until next time, take care. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our historical journey. Today, we're rediving into one of the most pivotal moments in early American history. The first contact between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag people. Imagine this. After a brutal winter that has tested their faith and thinned their ranks, the survivors of Plymouth Colony are just beginning to see the first signs of spring in 1621. They are isolated, vulnerable, and thousands of miles from everything they've ever known. The surrounding wilderness is a mystery, and they are acutely aware that they are not alone. For months, the relationship between the colonists and the land's original inhabitants had been one of distant, cautious observation. The Pilgrims had seen figures in the distance, watching them from the edges of the forest. They had found empty native dwellings and signs of a life that was utterly foreign to them. This bred a deep sense of suspicion and fear. Who were these people? Were they friends or foes? Every shadow could hide a threat, and every rustle in the woods sent hearts racing. They were on constant alert, their muskets never far from reach. On the other side, the Wampanoag people had every reason to be wary. They had witnessed the arrival of these strange ships, and these oddly dressed people. They had seen them take corn from storage pits left behind from a village ravaged by disease just a few years earlier. This was their land, their home. These newcomers were an unknown quantity. Were they just passing through, or were they here to stay? What were their intentions? Curiosity was certainly there, but it was heavily layered with distrust, born from previous negative encounters with other Europeans who had kidnapped their people and brought devastating plagues. The air was thick with unspoken questions and mutual apprehension. This delicate, tense standoff could have gone in so many different directions. The Pilgrims, huddled in their rough-hewn settlement, continued their daily work of building and planting, always with one eye on the forest. They were a small, struggling group, and they knew their survival was far from guaranteed. They needed help, but they had no idea how to ask for it, or what to ask. The Wampanoag, led by their sachem, Massasoit, were also in a precarious position. The diseases that had swept through the region had weakened their confederation, and they faced threats from rival tribal nations. They were weighing their options, observing the English, and trying to decide if these newcomers could be potential allies or a new danger. The stage was set for a dramatic encounter. But no one could have predicted how it would actually happen. On March 16th, 1621, the entire situation changed in an instant. A lone figure walked confidently out of the woods and straight into the heart of the Plymouth settlement. The colonists, likely grabbing their weapons and preparing for the worst, were stunned into silence. This man was not what they expected. He was tall, self-assured, and carried only a bow and 2 arrows. But the most astonishing thing about him was what he did next. He raised a hand in greeting and, in clear, if broken, English, he said, "Welcome, Englishman." Can you even imagine the shock, after months of fear and uncertainty, of seeing only silent, distant figures? Here was someone walking into their midst and speaking their own language. It must have felt like a scene from a dream. This man's name was Sami. He was a sachem from a tribe in what is now Maine, and he had learned English from fishermen and traders who had been visiting the northern coasts for years. He happened to be visiting Massasoit and the Wampanoag at the time. His arrival was the key that unlocked the door between 2 worlds that had been standing side by side. In uneasy silence, Massasoit wasn't just a casual visitor. He spent the night in Plymouth, sharing information that was absolutely vital to the Pilgrims. He gave them their first real understanding of the local landscape, the different tribal groups in the region, their leaders, and their relationships with one another. He explained that the very land they had settled on, which they called Plymouth, was known as Patuxet to the native people. He told them the tragic story of how the village's original inhabitants had all been wiped out by a plague a few years before their arrival. This explained the cleared fields and convenient location they had found. They were living in the ghost of a former community. This single conversation changed everything. The Pilgrims' abstract fears were replaced with concrete knowledge. They learned that the great leader of the region was Massasoit, and that he was a powerful and respected sage. Massasoit acted as a bridge of information, calming the fears of the English, and assuring them that the Wampanoag were not immediately hostile. He also brought this new information back to Massasoit, providing a clearer picture of who these English settlers were. They were not warriors or raiders. They were families, men, women, and children, looking to build a home. Massasoit's visit was more than just a friendly chat. It was the beginning of diplomacy. He promised he would return with another man, one whose English was even better and who had actually lived in England. This was the moment the Pilgrims had been desperately hoping for, a chance to establish peaceful relations and perhaps even secure an alliance that could ensure their survival. The appearance of Massasoit was the turning point. It broke the cycle of fear and suspicion and opened the door for communication, negotiation, and the complex relationship that would define the next 50 years. It was a single, brave act of reaching out that would lead directly to the formal treaty between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag, and to the famous harvest feast we now remember as the first Thanksgiving. This story of first contact is a powerful reminder of how communication can overcome fear. The arrival of one person, willing to bridge the gap between cultures, completely altered the course of history for both the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag. It shows us that even in the most tense and uncertain situations, a single voice can change everything. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter of our story. I hope you found it as fascinating as I do. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into history. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next episode, where we'll meet the legendary See you next time. Hello, and welcome back to our journey through history. Today, we delve into Chapter 6, a story of an unlikely friendship that became the cornerstone of a new colony's survival. This is the story of a man named Squanto, better known to us as Squanto. Imagine returning home after years of unimaginable hardship, only to find everything you ever knew and loved gone. This was Squanto's reality. A member of the Patuxet tribe, Squanto's life was violently upended when he was captured by an English explorer and sold into slavery in Spain. Through a series of incredible events, he eventually gained his freedom and, with the help of other explorers, began a long, arduous journey back to his homeland in what is now but the home he returned to was not the one he left. A devastating plague had swept through his village, leaving it silent and empty. The world he knew had vanished. It was in this desolate landscape, this ghost of his former life, that the Mayflower Pilgrims arrived in 1620, struggling to survive a harsh New England winter. In March of 1621, a truly astonishing moment occurred. Native American man walked confidently into the fledgling Plymouth settlement and greeted the stunned colonists in English. This was not Squanto just yet, but Samoset, an Abenaki leader who had learned some English from fishermen. After this initial contact, he returned with the man who would change everything. Squanto. Squanto's ability to speak English was a miracle for the Pilgrims. He had lived in England for a time during his journey home. Becoming fluent in the language, he became the crucial bridge between two vastly different worlds. He was more than just a translator. He was an ambassador, a diplomat who helped negotiate a vital peace treaty between the Pilgrims and the local Wampanoag tribe, led by their great chief, Massasoit. This treaty would last for over 50 years, a remarkable feat built on trust and mutual need. But Squanto's most immediate and practical contribution was as a teacher. The Pilgrims were farmers, but they were accustomed to English soil and seasons. Their seeds and methods were failing in the unfamiliar American environment. They were starving, and their hopes were dwindling. Squanto saw their plight and stepped in to guide them. He showed them the secrets of this new land, secrets passed down through generations of his people. He taught them how to cultivate corn, the staple crop of the Americas. He didn't just show them where to plant. He taught them the indigenous method of using local fish, like aloibs, as fertilizer. He would instruct them to place a few fish in the soil alongside the seeds, a technique that provided the necessary nutrients for the corn to thrive. It was a brilliant, sustainable practice the Pilgrims had never encountered. He led them to the best places to fish in the rivers and streams, showing them how to catch eels by treading them out of the muddy riverbeds with their feet. He taught them which native plants were safe to eat and which were poisonous. He showed them how to tap maple trees for sap, to make syrup, and how to hunt for deer and turkey in the dense forests. Essentially, Squanto provided the Pilgrims with a complete survival guide for the New World. He was their teacher, their guide, and their lifeline. Without Squanto, it is almost certain the Plymouth Colony would have failed. His knowledge, his willingness to help, and his ability to bridge the cultural gap were indispensable. He wasn't just teaching them to plant and fish. He was teaching them how to live in harmony with the land, as his people had done for centuries. He had lost his own community but found a new, albeit different, one to nurture and protect. Think about the profound resilience and grace Squanto must have possessed. After suffering betrayal and the complete loss of his people, he chose not to harbor bitterness, but to extend a hand of friendship and aid to the newcomers occupying the very land where his village once stood. It's a testament to his incredible character. He lived with the Pilgrims, sharing his life and knowledge with them until his death. A year and a half later, Governor William Bradford, in his journal, wrote of Squanto's passing, calling him a special instrument sent of God for their good, noting that the Pilgrims took his death as a great loss. The story of Squanto is often simplified, especially around Thanksgiving, but his true story is one of immense tragedy, incredible resilience, and ultimately, a powerful act of humanity. He was a man caught between two worlds, who, despite his own profound losses, chose to build bridges of understanding and cooperation. His friendship with the Pilgrims is not just a quaint historical footnote. It is a powerful lesson in empathy and the incredible impact one person can have on the course of history. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter. The story of early America is filled with complex and fascinating figures, and Squanto is truly one of the most important. If you found this story as moving as I do, please give this video a like and consider subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into history. We'd love to have you with us as we continue to explore the past. See you next time. Welcome back to our journey through history. When we last left the Pilgrims, they had endured a brutal first winter, their numbers decimated, their spirits tested. But as the snows of 1621 began to melt, something else began to thaw. The icy grip of despair. This is the story of their first spring, a season of hope, unexpected friendship, and the fragile beginnings of a new world. This is Chapter 7. The first spring of hope. The air, once filled with the sounds of coughing and sorrow, now carried the songs of birds returning and the gentle hum of renewed activity. The survivors, gaunt but resolute, emerged from their crude shelters, blinking in the strengthening sun. The forest, which had seemed so menacing, was now bursting with life. But the Pilgrims knew they couldn't survive on hope alone. They were farmers without knowledge of this new land, hunters unfamiliar with the game. Their supplies were nearly gone, and the planting season was upon them. Failure to produce a crop meant certain starvation come the next winter. It was in this moment of quiet desperation that a figure emerged from the woods, walking boldly into their fledgling settlement. He was not a warrior in threatening paint, but a single man who raised his hand in a sign of peace. To the utter astonishment of the Pilgrims, he greeted them in their own language, in broken but understandable English. His name was Samoset, a sachem from a tribe to the north, and he had learned some English from fishermen who had visited the coast. Samoset's arrival was like a key turning in a locked door. He spent the night sharing information and breaking the bread of peace. He told them of the land, of the various tribes, and of a great plague that had swept through the area years before, leaving the very ground they now occupied empty. This explained the strangely cleared fields and the absence of a native population in their immediate vicinity. He promised to return with someone who spoke even better English. True to his word, Samoset returned a few days later, and with him was Tisquantum, whom history would remember as Squanto. Squanto's story was one of immense tragedy and incredible resilience. He had been kidnapped by an English explorer years earlier, taken to Spain, and had eventually made his way to London before finally finding passage back to his homeland. But when he returned, he found his entire village, the Patuxet people, wiped out by the same plague Samoset had described. He was the last of his tribe. By a remarkable twist of fate, the Pilgrims had settled on the very land that had once been his home. Instead of viewing them with hatred or resentment, Squanto chose a different path. Perhaps seeing a chance to build a new community from the ashes of his old one, he decided to help them. He moved in with the Pilgrims, becoming their interpreter, their guide, and most importantly, their teacher. He was, as Governor William Bradford would later write, a special instrument sent of God for their good. Squanto showed them how to cultivate the native corn, a crop completely foreign to them. He taught them the Wampanoag method, to plant the kernels in small mounds, and to fertilize each mound with a fish, like an alewife, caught from the nearby streams. This technique was crucial for the sandy coastal soil. He pointed out which native plants were edible and which were poisonous. He guided them to the best places to fish and hunt. He was the bridge between their old world knowledge and their new world reality. Without him, it's almost certain the colony would have failed. Squanto also facilitated a more formal and lasting relationship. He arranged a meeting between Governor John Carver and the most powerful leader in the region, Massasoit, the great sachem of the Wampanoag Nation. This was a pivotal moment. The Wampanoag had watched the English from a distance, wary of these newcomers. They, too, were in a vulnerable position. The plague had weakened their numbers, making them susceptible to their rivals. The Narrated tribe, an alliance with the English, with their powerful muskets, could be mutually beneficial. The meeting was tense but formal. After an exchange of gifts and courtesies, with Squanto translating, they hammered out a treaty of mutual assistance. It was a simple but profound agreement. Neither party would harm the other. If any of their own people did, they would be punished. They would come to each other's aid if attacked by a third party, and when they visited each other, they would come unarmed. This treaty, one of the earliest between European colonists and Native Americans, would be honored for over 50 years. This fragile peace allowed the Plymouth Colony to flourish. With the guidance of Squanto and the security of the treaty with Massasoit, the Pilgrims set to their work with a renewed sense of purpose. They planted their fields 20 acres of corn and 6 acres of barley and peas. They built more substantial homes. They organized their defenses and established a functioning community. The constant fear of starvation and attack began to recede, replaced by the rhythm of hard work and the promise of a future. Throughout that spring and into the summer, a unique relationship developed. It wasn't a perfect harmony, and misunderstandings still occurred. The cultural gap was immense, but on a human level, connections were made. Pilgrims and Wampanoag. Men would hunt and fish together. They exchanged goods, English tools for native furs and foods. A sense of cautious trust began to grow, built on shared needs and mutual respect. The Wampanoag saw the Pilgrims' dedication and hard work. The Pilgrims saw the Wampanoag's generosity, wisdom, and deep knowledge of the land. This period stands in stark contrast to many other colonial encounters. It was a time when peaceful coexistence seemed not just possible, but was actively practiced. The help offered by Massasoit, Squanto, and Massasoit was not just a lucky break for the Pilgrims. It was a conscious choice made by native leaders for their own strategic and perhaps even compassionate reasons. They chose alliance over conflict, assistance over hostility. As the summer sun ripened the corn in the fields, the Pilgrims could look upon their settlement with a sense of accomplishment they could scarcely have imagined just a few months prior. The specter of death that had haunted their first winter was replaced by the sight of green shoots pushing through the earth. The first spring of hope had delivered its promise. But this was only the beginning. Their survival was far from guaranteed, and the harvest would be the true test. Join us next time as we witness the fruits of their labor in a moment of gratitude that would echo through the centuries. Thank you so much for watching. If you're finding this series insightful, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us continue to bring these stories to life. We'll see you in the next chapter. Welcome back to our journey through the past. Today, we're stepping into Chapter 8, A Bountiful Harvest. Imagine, after the grueling, heartbreaking winter of 1620, the first rays of a hopeful spring began to warm the earth at Plymouth. The settlers, thinned by sickness and despair, had to muster every ounce of strength they had left. Their very survival depended on the success of this first planting season in the New World. The ground, once frozen and unforgiving, was now softened by the spring rains. With guidance from their Wampanoag allies, particularly to Squanto. While Squanto, the Pilgrims began the arduous task of preparing the fields. They had brought seeds from England: wheat, barley, and peas, but these familiar crops struggled in the unfamiliar soil and climate of New England. The English wheat, for example, grew tall and looked promising, but the heads were empty of grain. It was a disheartening sight. But Squanto introduced them to a new, and ultimately, life-saving agricultural system. He told them to plant native corn, a crop perfectly suited to the local environment. But it wasn't just about putting a seed in the ground. He showed them a technique passed down through generations of his people, planting corn in small mounds, and when the stalks were a few inches high, planting beans and squash seeds around the base. This was the genius of the Three Sisters, a sustainable and symbiotic method of farming. The tall corn stalks provided a natural trellis for the bean vines to climb. The beans, in turn, were nitrogen, and the broad, sprawling leaves of the squash plants spread out across the ground, acting as a living mulch. They shaded the soil, keeping it moist and cool, while suppressing the growth of weeds. It was an elegant, ecological masterpiece, a testament to the deep agricultural wisdom of the native peoples. As the days grew longer and warmer, the settlers watched their fields with a mixture of hope and anxiety. They worked tirelessly, tending the young plants, weeding the rows, and chasing away birds and other pests. Every sprout that pushed through the soil was a small victory, a symbol of their resilience. The memory of the starving time was still fresh, a constant, grim reminder of what failure would mean. There was no turning back, no resupply ship on the immediate horizon. Everything hinged on this harvest. The summer of 1621 unfolded, and with it, a remarkable transformation began to take place across the Plymouth landscape. The once struggling English pea plants yielded a decent, if not spectacular, crop. Their barley was fair, but it was the native crops that truly flourished under the summer sun. The fields, once bare and brown, were now a vibrant sea of green. The corn stalks shot up, growing taller than a man, their tassels waving in the gentle coastal breeze. The bean vines wrapped themselves around the sturdy stalks, and beneath them, the broad squash leaves carpeted the earth, dotted with bright yellow blossoms. For the Pilgrims who had survived the horrors of that first winter, this sight was more than just a successful crop. It was a miracle. It was tangible proof that they might just make it in this new, wild land. The daily grind of survival began to ease, replaced by a growing sense of relief and profound gratitude. The children, who had been gaunt and weak, now had a little more energy to play among the rows of corn. The adults could breathe a little easier, the constant gnawing fear of starvation beginning to recede. As the summer waned and the first hints of autumn colored the leaves, the time for the harvest arrived. The settlers, men, women, and even the older children, went out into the fields. They gathered the heavy ears of Indian corn, 20 acres of it. They picked baskets full of beans and harvested the large, nutrient-rich squash. The bounty was astonishing, far exceeding their most optimistic hopes. Their small storehouses began to fill with food, a sight for sore eyes that brought tears of joy to many. The air in Plymouth was no longer filled with the sounds of coughing and mourning, but with the sounds of work, of community, and of hope. The success of the harvest did more than just fill their bellies. It filled their spirits. It fortified their resolve and gave them a foundation upon which to build their future. They had faced the brink of annihilation and had been pulled back by the grace of Providence and the crucial help of their Native American neighbors. This overwhelming sense of gratitude would soon culminate in a shared feast of celebration, an event that would echo through the centuries. But we'll explore that momentous occasion in our next chapter. Thank you so much for joining me on this part of the story. It's a powerful reminder of how resilience, cooperation, and a little bit of agricultural genius can overcome even the most daunting challenges. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into history. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you won't miss what happens next. See you in the next chapter. Welcome back to our journey through history. Today, we arrive at a moment that would echo through the centuries. A moment of gratitude and community forged in the harsh but beautiful landscape of the New World. We're in the autumn of 1621, and the Plymouth Colony is buzzing with a new kind of energy. After a year of immense hardship, a year that tested the limits of their endurance, the Pilgrims had finally seen their fortunes turn. The summer had been kind, and the fields, filled with knowledge shared by their Wampanoag neighbors, had yielded a bountiful harvest. Corn, beans, and squash, the staples of their new diet, were now stored in abundance, a reassuring sight against the coming winter. The specter of the starving time was finally fading into a painful memory. Seeing the full storehouses and the renewed spirit of his people, Governor William Bradford felt a deep sense of gratitude. This wasn't just about surviving. It was about thriving, about seeing the seeds of their labor, both literal and metaphorical, come to fruition. He knew this moment couldn't pass unmarked. It was a time to pause, to reflect, and to give thanks. Thanks to God for his providence, and thanks for the peace they had found in this new land. So, Governor Bradford stood before the small community, his voice carrying the weight of the year they had all endured. He declared that there would be a special celebration, a feast of thanksgiving. It would be a time to rejoice in their harvest, to appreciate their survival, and to acknowledge the blessings they had received. The colonists, who had known so much sorrow, embraced the idea with joy. The thought of a feast, a real feast, was a powerful symbol of hope and a welcome reward for their relentless work. But Governor Bradford's vision for this celebration extended beyond the walls of their small settlement. He knew, and every colonist knew, that their survival would have been impossible without the help and friendship of the Wampanoag people. It was Squanto who had taught them to plant corn, to fish the local rivers, and to find their way in the unfamiliar wilderness. It was the great sachem, Chief Massasoit, whose treaty of peace had ensured their safety and fostered a spirit of cooperation. To celebrate their good fortune without acknowledging these crucial allies would be incomplete, even unthinkable. And so, a decision was made. Messengers were chosen to carry an invitation from Governor Bradford to Chief Massasoit. They were tasked with a journey to Soams, the Wampanoag's main village, to extend a hand of friendship and invite the chief and his people to join the Pilgrims in their celebration. This was more than just a polite gesture. It was a profound act of recognition and a desire to share their bounty with those who had helped make it possible. The messengers set out, carrying with them the hopes of the entire colony for a shared moment of peace and fellowship. Imagine the scene as the messengers arrived in Massasoit's village. The air would have been filled with curiosity and perhaps a little uncertainty. An invitation to a feast from the English newcomers. It was an unprecedented event, but the relationship, built on mutual respect and the practicalities of survival, had proven strong. Chief Massasoit, a wise and pragmatic leader, understood the importance of maintaining this alliance. He accepted the invitation. The colonists began their preparations in earnest. The settlement, which had so often been a place of quiet toil and somber reflection, was now filled with the sounds of joyful activity. The men were sent out to hunt full fowl. Edward Winslow, in his later writings, noted that the governor sent 4 men on a fowling mission, and in just one day, they gathered enough turkey, ducks, and geese to last the colony for a week. The forests that had once seemed so intimidating were now providing the centerpiece for their feast. The women of Plymouth were equally busy, managing the hearths and ovens, preparing the harvest for the table. They would have been grinding corn into meal for bread and puddings, stewing pumpkins, and cooking the various vegetables they had so carefully cultivated. The tantalizing aromas of roasting meat and baking bread would have wafted through the small settlement, a scent of prosperity and celebration that had been absent for so long. It was a community effort, with every man, woman, and child contributing to the preparations for their honored guests. Then, the day arrived. Chief Massasoit did not come alone. He arrived at Plymouth with 90% of his men. 90. This was far more than the small band of colonists had anticipated. For a moment there might have been a flicker of concern. How could their modest provisions possibly feed so many? But any anxiety was quickly dispelled by the spirit of the occasion. The Wampanoag did not come empty-handed. Seeing the scale of the gathering, Massasoit sent some of his own men into the forest, and they soon returned with 5 deer, a generous contribution to the communal meal. And so, the feast began. It was not a formal, somber affair. It was a lively, 3-day festival. The English colonists, in their simple, dark clothing, and the Wampanoag, in their traditional deerskin and feathers, sat down together. They shared food, they shared stories, and they shared a moment of peace. The language barrier was likely overcome with the help of translators like Squanto. But more importantly, it was bridged by the universal language of shared food and mutual respect. They ate turkey, venison, waterfowl, corn, squash, and other local foods. They likely held games and athletic contests, demonstrating their skills in friendly competition. Imagine the Pilgrims, perhaps a bit stiffly, attempting to match the Wampanoag in a foot race, or the Wampanoag warriors showing their prowess with a bow and arrow. It was a cultural exchange, a vibrant and dynamic interaction between 2 very different worlds, united for a brief time by a common sense of gratitude. As they celebrated under the crisp autumn sky, no one present could have possibly grasped the future significance of their gathering. For them, it was simply a harvest festival, a moment to be thankful for a full belly and a peaceful neighbor. It was a temporary truce in a complex and often difficult relationship. They had no idea that this 3-day feast in 1621 would become the foundation for a national holiday celebrated centuries later. They couldn't have known that the image of Pilgrims and Native Americans sharing a meal would become an enduring, if somewhat simplified, symbol of American identity. This event, which would later be called the First Thanksgiving, was a unique moment in time. It represented the best of what was possible between the European newcomers and the indigenous people of the land. It was a testament to the fact that diplomacy, friendship, and shared humanity could, even for a short time, overcome fear and suspicion. It was a single, bright chapter of cooperation in a much longer and more complicated story. And as the feast concluded and Chief Massasoit and his men departed, the Plymouth colonists were left not only with full storehouses for the winter, but also with a strengthened bond of peace. This shared celebration solidified their alliance and ensured another season of relative security. It was a powerful reminder that in this vast and challenging new world, their greatest strength and their best hope for the future lay in their ability to come together, to share what they had, and to give thanks. Thank you so much for joining us for this chapter. The story of Plymouth is far from over, and the relationships forged during this time will continue to evolve in fascinating and complex ways. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss what comes next. We'll see you in the next chapter. Welcome, bike history lovers, to our ongoing journey through the early days of Plymouth Colony. Today, we arrive at a pivotal moment, a scene that has been etched into the American collective memory, though often misunderstood. This is Chapter 10. The Wampanoag arrival. Imagine the scene in the autumn of 1621. The small English settlement of Plymouth is buzzing with activity. They've just brought in their first successful harvest, a modest but vital achievement after a brutal first winter. The air is crisp, filled with the smell of wood smoke and roasting corn. Governor William Bradford has declared a celebration, a time to give thanks for their survival and the bounty that he managed to gather from this new, often unforgiving land. The Pilgrims, men, women, and children, are preparing for their feast. The sounds of their English dialects, the clatter of their simple cookware, and the unfamiliar scents of their cooking fill their small village. It's a moment of cautious optimism, a brief respite from the constant struggle. But then, a new sound cuts through the familiar hum of the settlement. It's a sound from the forest, a sound of many voices and many footsteps approaching. Out from the tree line they emerge, not one or two, but a large contingent. Over 90 men, strong and purposeful, walking with the confidence that comes from knowing this land is their home for millennia. These are the Wampanoag, led by their great Sachem. This wasn't an invasion, nor was it a random coincidence. Massasoit had been an ally, a crucial figure in the Pilgrims' survival, guided by the invaluable interpreter Tisquantum, or Squanto as the Pilgrims called him. Hearing the celebratory musket fire from the Pilgrims' festivities, Massasoit came to investigate, perhaps to ensure all was well, or perhaps to reinforce the alliance they had forged months earlier. The Pilgrims, though they had an alliance, must have been taken aback. There were only about 50 of them left, and now they were faced with nearly double that number of Wampanoag warriors. A moment of tension might have hung in the air. What would happen next? But instead of conflict, something remarkable occurred. The Wampanoag didn't arrive empty-handed. They came bearing gifts, a contribution to the feast. Their hunters carried 5 freshly harvested deer, a significant offering that would more than double the amount of food available. Along with the venison, they brought baskets filled with fish, eels, and wild fowl, all expertly gathered from the very woods and waters that the Pilgrims were still learning to navigate. Their arrival transformed the Pilgrims' small Thanksgiving into something much grander, a truly communal event. This was the meeting of 2 profoundly different worlds. On one side, you have the English Pilgrims. Their language was foreign, their clothes were made of heavy wool and linen, and their customs were shaped by a strict religious doctrine that had driven them across an ocean. Their food, even what they grew here, was prepared in ways familiar to them from their homes in England and Holland. They were organized, disciplined, and trying to replicate a society they had left behind. On the other side stood the Wampanoag. Their language was Massachusetts, a part of the Algonquian language family, a tongue that echoed the sounds of the very nature around them. They were dressed in deerskin, their bodies adorned with decorations that held deep cultural meaning. Their way of life was intricately woven into the seasons and the rhythms of the natural world. They were a people with a rich history, a complex social structure, and a deep spiritual connection to the land the Pilgrims now called New Plymouth. As the preparations for the great feast began in earnest, a fascinating dynamic unfolded. Imagine the scene: Wampanoag, men skilled hunters and warriors, demonstrating how to properly roast a deer over an open fire, a technique far different from the Pilgrims' methods of stewing or baking. Pilgrim women, in turn, might have shared their baked goods, bread and puddings made from the corn flour they had painstakingly ground. Language was a barrier, of course. Squanto was indispensable, moving between the groups, translating not just words but concepts, bridging the gap between 2 entirely different ways of understanding the world. But communication isn't just about words. It's about gestures, smiles, and shared experiences. A Wampanoag man showing a Pilgrim boy how to fletch an arrow. A Pilgrim woman offering a taste of a corn pudding to a curious Wampanoag elder. This wasn't a formal, stiff diplomatic dinner. It was a 3-day festival. There were games, demonstrations of skill. The Pilgrims, with their military training under Captain Miles, likely demonstrated their muskets, the loud crack of gunfire echoing through the clearing. In response, the Wampanoag men would have showcased their own formidable skills with the bow and arrow. Their silent, deadly accuracy, a testament to a lifetime of practice. It was a show of strength, yes, but it was also a form of mutual entertainment and respect. Each side was curious about the other. The Pilgrims, who had seen the Wampanoag as savages, were now witnessing their generosity, their social organization, and their profound knowledge of the environment. The Wampanoag, who had seen their world devastated by diseases brought by earlier Europeans, were cautiously engaging with this new group of settlers, perhaps seeing a path to a mutually beneficial future. Throughout these 3 days, a sense of shared humanity must have prevailed. Despite the different languages, the different foods, and the vastly different customs, they were all people. They were sharing a meal, sharing a moment of peace and plenty under the same autumn sky. The Wampanoag showed the Pilgrims how to prepare native foods like turkey, which was abundant in the region, and likely shared vegetables and fruits the Pilgrims had never seen before. The Pilgrims, with their European crops, offered a different kind of bounty. This exchange was more than just politeness. It was a sharing of cultures, a moment where boundaries blurred. Children from both groups, less constrained by adult prejudices, may have played together, their laughter a universal language that needed no translation. This event, which we now call the first Thanksgiving, was a complex intersection of politics, survival, and human curiosity. For the Pilgrims, it was proof that they could survive and perhaps even thrive in this new world, not just against the elements, but alongside its native inhabitants. For Massasoit and the Wampanoag, it was a strategic reinforcement of an alliance with a group that possessed powerful technology and could be a buffer against their rivals, the Narragansets tribe. But beyond the politics, for those 3 days, there was a spirit of cooperation and mutual respect. The curiosity was palpable. 2 worlds, separated by an ocean and thousands of years of different history, came together not in conflict, but in a shared celebration of the harvest. It was a rare peaceful moment in a history that would soon become fraught with tension and misunderstanding. The seeds of future conflict were already there, but for this brief time, they lay dormant beneath a blanket of shared food and tentative friendship. Thank you so much for joining us for this chapter. The story of Plymouth is filled with these incredible moments of human interaction, and it's by looking closely at them that we can begin to understand the full picture. If you're enjoying this journey through history, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us continue to create this content for you. We'll see you next time as we continue our exploration of Plymouth Colony. Hello, and welcome back to our journey through history. Today, we're diving into a story many of us think we know, but the details are richer and more fascinating than you might imagine. We're stepping back to the autumn of 1621, to a moment of peace and shared celebration that would echo through centuries. This is the story of the very first Thanksgiving, a feast that wasn't just a single meal, but a 3-day festival of gratitude, games, and newfound friendship. So, picture this. The year is 1621. The Pilgrims, having survived their first brutal winter in the New World, have finally seen their hard work pay off. Their first harvest at Plymouth is a success. They have corn, barley, and peas stored for the coming winter. Governor William Bradford, filled with relief and gratitude, decides it's time to rejoice together for their bounty. He sends 4 men out on a fowling mission, what we'd call a bird hunt today, to gather provisions for a special celebratory feast. But this celebration wasn't just for the colonists. The Pilgrims had formed a crucial, if sometimes tense, alliance with the local Wampanoag tribe. Without their help, especially from figures like Tisquantum or Squanto, who taught them how to cultivate native crops, the colonists likely wouldn't have survived. As word of the Pilgrims' preparations spread, the Wampanoag leader, Massasoit, arrived at the Plymouth settlement, and he didn't come alone. He brought with him 90 of his men. Imagine the scene. About 50 English colonists, including women and children, suddenly hosting nearly 100 Wampanoag warriors. It must have been a startling, yet momentous sight. The arrival of Massasoit and his men transformed a simple harvest meal into a diplomatic gathering, a festival stretching over 3 full days. The Pilgrims had brought back plenty of wildfowl, but it wouldn't be enough for this many people. In a gesture of goodwill, Massasoit sent some of his own men into the forest. They returned shortly after, not empty-handed, but with 5 deer to contribute to the feast. This act of sharing set the tone for the entire event. It wasn't one group hosting another. It was 2 communities coming together to share what they had. Now, let's talk about the food, because it was a far cry from the Thanksgiving table we know today. Forget mashed potatoes, gravy, and cranberry sauce. From a can, the star of the show was venison, thanks to the Wampanoag's contribution. Wild turkey was certainly on the menu, as Governor Bradford noted, but it was just one of many roasted birds. They also had ducks, geese, and possibly even swan and passenger pigeons. The sky and forests were teeming with game. From the sea came another bounty. The colonists had learned to fish and gather shellfish from the abundant coastline. So, the tables, or more likely blankets on the ground, would have been laden with cod, bass, eels, clams, lobster, and mussels. Imagine the smoky aroma of all this seafood and meat roasting over open fires. It would have been a true feast for the senses. What about the vegetables? Corn was central. This wasn't the sweet corn we eat today, but flint corn, which was dried and pounded into a cornmeal. This meal was then likely boiled into a thick porridge or mush, a staple that had kept the Pilgrims alive. They might have also served it as samp, a dish of broken corn kernels. Pumpkins and other squashes were also plentiful. They were unbaked into pies. Sugar and flour were scarce, but likely roasted in the embers of the fire or boiled to create a savory side dish. Wild berries, like cranberries, were available, but they would have been used for their tart flavor, not sweetened into a sauce. Nuts like walnuts, chestnuts, and beechnuts would have been gathered from the forest and added to the spread. So, you have this incredible, diverse menu, a true reflection of the local environment. But the 3 days weren't just about eating. This was a festival. It was a time for entertainment and interaction. The air would have been filled with a mix of languages: the Pilgrims, English dialects, and the Wampanoag, Algonquin tongue, with interpreters like Squanto bridging the communication gap. There were games and displays of skill. The English colonists, particularly soldiers like Captain Miles Standish, would have demonstrated their military drills, firing their muskets into the air. This was partly a show of strength, a subtle reminder of their power, but also a form of entertainment. The loud reports of the muskets would have been a startling sound in the quiet wilderness. In response, the Wampanoag men would have showcased their own skills. They were expert archers, and it's easy to imagine friendly competitions, seeing who could shoot an arrow with the most accuracy and force. They likely engaged in foot races, wrestling matches, and other contests of strength and agility. These weren't hostile competitions, but a way for the two groups of men to size each other up, to build rapport and mutual respect through shared activity. Imagine the laughter and cheers as a young Pilgrim boy tried to outrun a swift Wampanoag warrior, or the grunts of effort during a friendly wrestling match. There was also likely singing and dancing. Both cultures had their own traditions of music and celebration. While we don't have detailed records of what songs were sung, it's a powerful image to consider. The solemn hymns of the Pilgrims perhaps mingling with the rhythmic chants and drum beats of the Wampanoag. It represents a brief, harmonious moment where two vastly different worlds intersected peacefully. This 3-day event was a unique moment in time. It was a period of mutual dependence and, for a little while, genuine friendship. The Pilgrims were celebrating their survival and their successful harvest, a feat they knew was only possible because of the Wampanoag's guidance. The Wampanoag, for their part, were engaging with these newcomers, solidifying an alliance that was politically beneficial for them against rival tribes. For those 3 days, they weren't just colonists and natives. They were neighbors, sharing a moment of peace and plenty. It's important to remember that this wasn't called Thanksgiving at the time. To the Pilgrims, a Thanksgiving was a specific religious observance, a day of prayer and fasting, not feasting. They would have seen this as a secular harvest festival, a time of recreation and good cheer. The label of the first Thanksgiving was applied much later, as Americans looked back and crafted a national origin story. As the 3rd day drew to a close, the fires died down, and the last of the food was eaten. Massasoit and his 90 men departed, returning to their own village. The Pilgrims returned to their daily routines, preparing for the looming winter. The festival was over. This fragile peace, this moment of shared humanity, would unfortunately not last. As more colonists arrived and land disputes grew, the relationship between the English and the Native Americans would become strained and eventually break into open conflict. But for those 3 days in the autumn of 1621, something remarkable happened. Two cultures, separated by an ocean of differences in language, religion, and custom, came together. They ate together, played together, and shared in the bounty of the land. They demonstrated that peaceful coexistence was possible. This event, frozen in time, serves as a powerful symbol. It's a reminder of the importance of gratitude, not just for a harvest, but for the help and kindness of others. It's a story about diplomacy and the simple human act of sharing a meal. While the broader history is complex and often tragic, the spirit of that 1621 Harvest Festival, a spirit of community, sharing, and mutual respect is what continues to resonate with us today, forming the core of the holiday we now celebrate. It's a testament to a fleeting moment when two worlds met not in conflict, but in celebration. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the past. It's in understanding these details that we truly connect with our history. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more journeys into the moments that shaped our world. We love having you here, and we'll see you in the next chapter. Welcome back to our journey through history. Today, we arrive at a truly poignant moment, a chapter filled with reflection, gratitude, and the promise of peace. After enduring unimaginable hardships, the survivors of that first brutal winter now stand on the cusp of something new, something hopeful. This is Chapter 12, Gratitude and Peace. Imagine the scene. The air is crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and roasting food. The long tables are laden, not just with the fruits of a successful harvest, but with the weight of memory and the lightness of survival. For the pilgrims gathered here, this is more than just a meal. It's a profound moment of reflection. Each kernel of corn, each piece of wild turkey, is a symbol of their perseverance. They aren't just giving thanks for the food on the table. They're giving thanks for life itself. They're thanking God for seeing them through the darkness, for the strength to rebuild, and for the simple, incredible gift of being alive to see this day. Look around this gathering. You see faces etched with the memory of loss, but also lit with the glow of community. They remembered the loved ones who didn't make it, the empty spaces at the table that can never truly be filled. Yet, in their shared survival, they've forged a bond stronger than steel. This gratitude extends beyond their own small group. It encompasses the very land that has sustained them and the unexpected alliances that have made this harvest possible. It's a moment of deep, collective thanks for the chance to begin again, to plant seeds, not just in the soil, but for a future they are building together, hand in hand. And at the heart of this gathering is a remarkable act of diplomacy and friendship. We see Massasoit, the great sachem of the Wampanoag, a leader of immense dignity and wisdom, sitting with Governor William Bradford. This isn't a tense negotiation or a meeting of rivals. It's a meeting of equals, of survivors, of men who understand the delicate balance of power and peace. In this moment, they exchange more than just pleasantries. They exchange gifts, tangible symbols of their mutual respect and goodwill. These aren't lavish treasures, but items of practical and symbolic value. Perhaps a finely crafted knife from Bradford, a token of English artisanship. In return, maybe a string of wampum beads from Massasoit, representing a sacred promise in his culture. Each gift is a pledge. With these simple objects, they are renewing the treaty they forged months earlier. They are reaffirming their promise to live in peace, to support one another, and to not bring harm to each other's people. Bradford, a man guided by his faith and a deep sense of responsibility for his flock, sees in Massasoit not a savage, but a partner. Massasoit, a shrewd leader who has witnessed the decline of his people from disease, sees in these newcomers not just a threat, but a potential ally in a changing world. This exchange is a powerful testament to their shared humanity, a quiet but firm declaration that peace is the only path forward. It's a personal commitment between two leaders that will ripple outwards, shaping the fate of both their communities in the crucial years to come. Now, let's take a step back and truly appreciate the significance of this harmony. To understand the light of this moment, we must remember the profound darkness that preceded it. Think back to the brutal Atlantic crossing on the Mayflower, a vessel crammed with anxious souls, tossed about by violent storms for over 2 months. They arrived not to a welcoming shore, but to a desolate, wind-swept coast in the dead of winter. The first few months were a living nightmare, a period they called the general sickness. Disease, fueled by malnutrition and exposure, swept through the tiny settlement like a wildfire. At its peak, only a handful of individuals were well enough to care for the sick and dying. They fetched wood, made fires, cooked what little food they had, and tended to their ailing friends and family, often becoming sick themselves in the process. The toll was staggering. There were only 102 passengers who arrived. Nearly half were gone by the end of that first winter. Every single day brought fresh grief, and the grim task of burying another loved one in the frozen ground. The dream of a new life seemed to be dying with them. The air was filled, not with the sounds of a thriving community, but with the sounds of coughing, weeping, and the constant fear of who would be next. Compare that desolate scene with the one before us now. The contrast is almost breathtaking. The haunting silence of the first winter has been replaced by the lively sounds of conversation and even laughter. The gnawing hunger has been replaced by a feast, a bounty from the land they have learned to cultivate with the help of their Wampanoag neighbors. The profound isolation has been replaced by a gathering of nearly 150 pilgrims and Wampanoag, alike sharing food and fellowship. The fear and despair have given way to a palpable sense of relief and hope. This moment of peace and plenty is not just a welcome respite. It is a victory. It's a victory over the illness, over sickness, and over the initial mistrust that existed between these two very different cultures. The harmony we witness is a direct result of conscious choices made by both sides. The Pilgrims chose to seek help rather than succumb to pride. The Wampanoag, led by Massasoit, chose diplomacy over conflict, seeing a path to mutual benefit. This feast, this shared moment of gratitude, stands as a powerful symbol of what is possible when people choose to see the humanity in one another, even in the most challenging of circumstances. It is a fragile, beautiful peace, born from the ashes of immense hardship, and it shines all the brighter because of the darkness they overcame to achieve it. This chapter in their story reminds us of the incredible resilience of the human spirit. It teaches us that even after the most devastating storms, there is the possibility of a calm and sunny day. It shows that gratitude is not just an emotion felt in times of ease, but a powerful force that can be cultivated in the very midst of adversity, a force that can bind people together and illuminate the path forward. It's a lesson in hope, a testament to the idea that peace, however fleeting, is always worth striving for. Thank you so much for joining me on this exploration of history. If you found this story as moving as I did, please give this video a like and consider subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into the past. Your support means the world and helps us continue to share these important narratives. Until next time, take care. Hey everyone, welcome back. Today, we're diving into a chapter of our story that's both complex and crucial, a part often left out of the simpler We're calling it Shadows of the Future, because while the first Thanksgiving represents a moment of peace, it wasn't a promise of lasting harmony. It was a single, hopeful day, casting a very long and complicated shadow. Imagine standing at that feast in 1621. For a moment, two vastly different cultures found common ground. They shared food. They shared a moment of gratitude. It's a beautiful image, right? But history is never just one single image. The peace of that day was fragile, like a thin layer of ice over a deep, fast-moving river. Beneath the surface, the currents of change were already swirling, and unfortunately, they weren't all moving towards a shared, peaceful future. As the years turned into decades, the small Plymouth Colony grew. More ships arrived from England, bringing thousands of new settlers. They weren't just seeking religious freedom anymore. They were seeking land, resources, and a new life. This expansion, this insatiable hunger for more, began to press against the boundaries of the Wampanoag and other native nations who had lived on this land for millennia. The world the Wampanoag had known for countless generations was shrinking, day by day. The mutual respect that characterized those early interactions began to erode. New colonial leaders emerged who didn't share Governor Carver or William Bradford's initial diplomacy. They saw the native people not as neighbors or allies, but as obstacles to their expansion. Likewise, the original Wampanoag leaders, like Massasoit, who had championed peace, were succeeded by a new generation who watched with growing alarm as their ancestral lands were fenced off, their resources depleted, and their way of life threatened. The tension was like a drumbeat, growing louder and more insistent with each passing year. Small disputes over land ownership, livestock, and legal jurisdiction escalated. What was once a relationship of cautious cooperation morphed into one of suspicion and mistrust. The English legal system was imposed on native peoples, who had their own complex systems of justice. Promises were made and then broken, and the balance of power shifted dramatically. The colonists, with their growing numbers and superior firepower, held an advantage that became increasingly difficult to ignore. This growing friction would eventually erupt into open conflict. The most significant of these was King Philip's War in 1675, a devastating conflict that tore New England apart. Metacom, the son of Massasoit, very same leader who had secured the peace in 1621, led a coalition of tribes in a desperate last-ditch effort to push back the English tide. It was a brutal, bloody war that resulted in immense loss of life on both sides. But in the end, the native coalition was defeated. The war shattered the power of the southern New England tribes and resulted in the loss of nearly all their remaining land. This is the painful, difficult part of the story. The dream of coexistence that flickered to life at that first feast was extinguished by the flames of war. For the descendants of those native peoples, the story of Thanksgiving is not just a tale of a harvest meal. It's a reminder of a beginning that led to an end of their sovereignty, the loss of their lands, and the start of a long struggle for survival and cultural preservation that continues to this day. So, how do we look at Thanksgiving now, knowing all this? It's not about canceling the holiday or feeling guilty about gathering with family. Instead, it's about adding depth and truth to the story. We can hold both realities at once. We can be grateful for the good things in our lives, for family and for peace, while also acknowledging the full, painful history of how this nation was formed. The story of Thanksgiving becomes a powerful symbol. It's a symbol of hope and the possibility of different cultures coming together. But it's also a symbol of a promise unfulfilled. A cautionary tale about the consequences of broken treaties and unchecked expansion. It teaches us that peace requires constant effort, mutual respect, and a commitment to justice. It's not something that happens in a single day. It has to be built and maintained, generation after generation. By understanding this fuller history, we honor everyone involved. We honor the Pilgrims who sought a new life, and the Wampanoag who showed them how to survive. We also honor the memory of all those who came after, who experienced the conflict, the loss, and the enduring legacy of those first encounters. The shadow of the future that was cast from that 1621 feast is long, and it reaches all the way to us today. It challenges us to learn, to remember, and to strive for a future where the promise of that first Thanksgiving one of mutual respect and peace can finally be realized. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through a more complete history. It's not always easy, but it's always important. If this conversation resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that shape our world. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time. Hey everyone, welcome back to our journey through the real story of Thanksgiving. Last time, we left off with that famous feast in 1621. Now, you might think the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag just kept having Thanksgiving dinner every year after that, building a beautiful tradition. But the truth is, what happened next is one of the most forgotten chapters in American history. This is the story of the lost decades. After that brief moment of shared harvest in 1621, the event itself just faded away. It wasn't recorded as the first Thanksgiving to the people who were there. It was a one-time harvest festival, a moment of relief after a brutal winter. It wasn't immediately repeated, and it certainly wasn't seen as the start of a national holiday. For almost 200 years, the story of that feast was largely lost to history, buried in a single letter written by Edward Winslow. So, what was happening instead? Well, America was happening, but not in the peaceful, harmonious way we often imagine. The English colonies began to expand rapidly. More ships arrived, bringing thousands of new settlers who weren't part of that original Plymouth group. They didn't share the same experiences or relationships with the native peoples. These new colonists were hungry for land, and as they pushed further and further into native territories, Tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface began to boil over. The fragile peace that had existed in 1621 started to crack. Conflicts, both small and large, became more frequent. The spirit of cooperation that marked the 1621 feast was replaced by suspicion, competition for resources, and tragic misunderstandings. Early settlers found themselves in a new reality, one defined by hardship, struggle, and new, devastating wars that would reshape the continent forever. The initial alliance between the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims, born of mutual need, couldn't withstand the immense pressure of colonization. So, if Thanksgiving wasn't a big annual party, what was it? Throughout this period, the concept of a Thanksgiving did exist, but it was very different from our modern holiday. These were local, often spontaneous, religious observances. A community might declare a day of thanksgiving to God for a good harvest, for rain after a drought, or for survival after a difficult period. It wasn't about turkey and cranberry sauce. It was a solemn day of prayer and gratitude, declared by a local governor or a church leader whenever they saw fit. There was no set date. A Thanksgiving could happen in October in one town, and in May in another. It was a deeply personal and local affair, not a unified national tradition. The idea of all Americans sitting down on the same day to eat the same meal was completely unheard of. Each colony, and later each state, had its own customs and its own reasons to give thanks. The 1621 feast was just one of countless local events, and for a long, long time, it wasn't even the most famous one. This period is crucial because it shatters the myth of a straight line from 1621 to today. The road to our modern Thanksgiving was long, winding, and full of forgotten twists. The holiday we celebrate wasn't inevitable. It had to be invented, or rather, reinvented, much later. The story of that reinvention is where things get really interesting, and it involves a forgotten founding father, a determined magazine editor, and a nation torn apart by civil war. The lost decades show us that history isn't a neat and tidy story. It's complex and often contradictory. The peace of 1621 was real, but so were the conflicts that followed. The gratitude was genuine, but it existed alongside immense struggle and change. Forgetting this period means we miss a huge part of the American story. The messy, complicated, and ultimately human process of how a nation and its traditions are actually formed. Understanding this gap in the timeline is essential. It helps us see that Thanksgiving, as a national concept, is a much more modern invention than most of us realize. It wasn't a hand-me-down from the Pilgrims. Instead, it was a tradition that was deliberately crafted and promoted for specific reasons, at a specific time in American history, and we're going to dive into exactly how that happened in our next chapter. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. It's a story that deserves to be told in its entirety. If you're finding this journey as fascinating as I am, please hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. We've got so much more to uncover. See you in the next video. Hello, history lovers, and welcome back to our deep dive into the story of Thanksgiving. In our last episode, we saw how the initial Thanksgiving traditions began to fade. Today, in Chapter 15, we're re-exploring the revival of Thanksgiving and how a nearly forgotten holiday was brought back from the brink to become the celebration we know and love. So, how did this happen? Let's travel back to the 1800s, a time when Thanksgiving was celebrated sporadically, if at all. It wasn't a national holiday, and different states observed it on different days, creating a patchwork of local customs. The grand, unified feast we picture today was simply not a reality. It seemed like the spirit of that original harvest gathering was slowly disappearing from the American consciousness. But one person refused to let it fade away. Enter the hero of our story, Sarah Josepha Halley. You might know her as the author of the nursery rhyme, Mary Had a Little Lamb. But her influence on American culture extends far beyond that. Halley was a prolific writer, a tastemaker, and the editor of the most popular women's magazine of her time, Godey's Lady's Book, She was, in many ways, one of the first true American influencers. Halley had a powerful vision. She saw Thanksgiving not just as a day for a good meal, but as a day to unify a rapidly growing and often divided nation. She believed that a national day of thanks, celebrated by everyone from the Atlantic to the Pacific, could be a powerful force for good, a moment to set aside differences and express gratitude together, As one people, she envisioned a holiday that would strengthen family bonds and reinforce a sense of shared American identity. For over 3 decades, starting in the 1820s, Sarah Josepha Halley embarked on a relentless campaign. She used her magazine as a platform, writing passionate editorials year after year, urging her millions of readers to embrace the idea of a national Thanksgiving. She published Thanksgiving-themed recipes for turkey, stuffing, and pumpkin pie, essentially creating the menu that we now consider traditional. She shared stories and poems that painted a cozy, idealized picture of families gathering around the dinner table, helping to shape the very image of Thanksgiving in the popular imagination. But she didn't stop there. Halley understood that to make this dream a reality, she needed to get the attention of the nation's leaders. So, she began a massive letter-writing campaign. She wrote 2 governors, senators, and congressmen. And most importantly, she wrote 2 presidents. She wrote to Zachary Taylor, Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, and James Buchanan. For years, her pleas were met with polite dismissals. The federal government was hesitant to proclaim a national holiday, viewing it as a matter for the states to decide. While Halley was championing the holiday's future, others were busy reimagining its past. It was during this period that the story of the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag in 1621 started to gain prominence. Historians and writers began to romanticize that harvest feast, transforming it into the first Thanksgiving. This narrative of brave settlers and friendly Native Americans sharing a peaceful meal was a powerful and appealing legend. It provided the holiday with a compelling origin story, a historical anchor that made Hale's campaign for a national celebration even more resonant. This newly crafted legend of the first Thanksgiving began to take shape in books, plays, and public speeches. It presented a simplified, idealized version of history, but it captured the public's imagination. It gave Americans a shared story to rally around, a foundational myth that seemed to embody the nation's best ideals of gratitude, community, and perseverance. The story provided the historical why for the holiday Halley was so passionately advocating for. Hale's persistence was legendary. Year after year, letter after letter, she refused to give up. Her campaign finally reached its climax during one of the darkest chapters in American history, the Civil War. In 1863, with the nation torn apart by conflict, Halley saw an even more urgent need for a day of unity and gratitude. She wrote a powerful letter to President Abraham Lincoln, arguing that a national day of Thanksgiving could help heal the nation's wounds and bring people together, even in the midst of war. This time, her message landed. President Lincoln, seeking to foster a sense of unity and hope, was moved by her appeal. In October 1863, he issued a proclamation declaring the last Thursday of November as a national day of thanksgiving and praise. Thanks to the tireless, decades-long efforts of Sarah Josepha Halley, Thanksgiving was finally an official, annual, national holiday. Her vision had become a reality. The revival was complete. What had been a fading, regional custom was now enshrined as a cornerstone of American life. The legend of the first Thanksgiving provided the historical roots, and Hale's campaign provided the modern framework, complete with the now iconic menu. The holiday was no longer just a memory of a harvest feast. It was a forward-looking celebration of family, unity, and gratitude, designed to bring a diverse nation together. It's an incredible story of how one determined individual can truly shape a nation's culture. Without Sarah Josepha Halley, we might not be celebrating Thanksgiving as we do today. Her legacy is present in every slice of pumpkin pie and every family gathering each November. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter in the history of Thanksgiving. It's a testament to the power of a great idea and unwavering perseverance. Be sure to hit that like button if you enjoyed this story, and subscribe so you don't miss our next episode, where we'll explore how Thanksgiving continued to evolve in the 20th century. We'll see you next time. Hello, history buffs, and welcome back to our deep dive into the story of Thanksgiving. In our last chapter, we saw how the holiday was celebrated in fits and starts, a regional tradition more than a national one. But today, we're talking about the moment everything changed. We're heading to the heart of the American Civil War, a time of unprecedented division and bloodshed. To witness how one of the nation's most revered presidents transformed a local harvest festival into a powerful symbol of American unity. This is the story of Abraham Lincoln's proclamation. The year is 1863. The United States is tearing itself apart. The battles of Gettysburg and Vicksburg have just concluded, marking a turning point in the war. But the cost in human life is staggering. The future of the nation hangs precariously in the balance. In the midst of this chaos, President Abraham Lincoln, a man weighed down by the sorrows of a fractured country, is looking for a way to bring people together to find a glimmer of hope in the darkest of times. He wasn't just thinking about military strategy. He was thinking about the soul of the nation. The idea to make Thanksgiving a national holiday didn't come from Lincoln alone. For years, a persistent and influential magazine editor named Sarah Josepha Hawley had been campaigning for it. You might know her as the author of Mary Had a Little Lamb, but her real passion project was creating a national day of Thanksgiving. She wrote countless editorials and sent letters to president after president, arguing that a shared day of thanks could help bind the country's wounds. For decades, her pleas were largely ignored. But in 1863, her letter landed on the desk of a president who understood exactly what she was trying to achieve. Lincoln saw the power in her idea. On October 3, 1863, he issued a proclamation. It's a truly remarkable document, and I encourage you to read it in full sometime. It acknowledges the civil strife of unequaled magnitude and severity that grips the nation. Yet, in the same breath, it points to the blessings that still remain: bountiful harvests, continued progress in mines and workshops, and a population that was, remarkably, still growing. Lincoln saw these not as reasons for complacency, but as gracious gifts of the Most High God. He wasn't ignoring the war. He was asking Americans to look beyond it for a moment, to find common ground in gratitude. The proclamation invited all Americans, whether in the North, the South, at home, or serving abroad, to set apart the last Thursday of November as a day of thanksgiving and praise. It was a radical act of hope. Imagine being a soldier in the field, or a family who had lost a son, being asked to give thanks. It wasn't about celebrating victory or ignoring suffering. It was about acknowledging a shared humanity and a shared dependence on something greater than the conflict that divided them. It was an appeal for national healing, a call to remember that even in the midst of war, they were all still part of one nation, under one sky. This is where the story we've been tracing really clicks into place. To give this new national holiday a sense of history and legitimacy, people began to look back, and the story they latched onto was that of the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag in 1621. That small, local harvest feast, which had been celebrated and retold in New England for generations, was now elevated. It became the origin story, the historical anchor for Lincoln's national holiday. The 1621 gathering was reframed as the first Thanksgiving, a foundational moment of peace and cooperation, a perfect narrative for a nation desperately seeking unity. This connection wasn't accidental. The image of two different groups coming together to share a meal resonated deeply in a country split in two. The story of the Pilgrims' hardship and survival mirrored the struggles of the nation itself. Lincoln, 1863. Proclamation to the 1621 feast, Americans created a powerful national myth. It was a story that said, "We've faced hardship before. We've come together before. We can do it again." The tale of Plymouth Rock became a cornerstone of American identity, taught to school children and immortalized in art and literature, all in service of this new, unified vision of Thanksgiving. But it's crucial to understand that this version of the story was highly romanticized. It smoothed over the complex and often tragic history between European settlers and Native Americans. The narrative that became popular focused on the peace and friendship of that one meal, while largely ignoring the decades of conflict, displacement, and disease that followed. The Wampanoag, who were so central to the survival of the Pilgrims, were often reduced to simple, background characters in their own story. The Thanksgiving myth, while powerful in its ability to unite white Americans, simultaneously erased the much more complicated and painful truths of colonization. So, as Thanksgiving became an official, annual American tradition, it carried with it this dual legacy. On one hand, it was a beautiful sentiment born from the trauma of the Civil War, a day for gratitude, family, and national unity. Lincoln's vision was one of profound hope and reconciliation. On the other hand, its historical foundation was built on an idealized and incomplete version of the past. It celebrated a moment of peace while obscuring a much longer history of conflict. This tension between the holiday's inspiring ideals and its complicated historical roots is something that continues to shape our understanding of Thanksgiving even today. And there you have it, the moment Thanksgiving went from a regional custom to a fixture on the national calendar. All thanks to the vision of Abraham Lincoln and the long campaign of Sarah Josepha Halley during one of America's most difficult hours. But the story isn't over. How did this Civil War era holiday transform into the Turkeyan football extravaganza we know today? That's what we'll explore in our next chapter as we move into the 20th century. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through history. If you're finding this series interesting, please hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter. See you then.
Hey everyone,
And welcome back to our deep dive into history. Today, we're tackling a story many of us learned as children. A story that has become a cornerstone of American identity. The story of the first Thanksgiving. We're in chapter 17, the myth and the memory. Let's start with a picture you've probably seen before. Think about your elementary school textbooks or those classic paintings. What do you see? You see pilgrims in their black hats and buckled shoes, sitting peacefully alongside Native Americans, who are often depicted in feathered headdresses. They're sharing a bountiful feast, side by side. In perfect harmony. It's a powerful and heartwarming image, isn't it? A scene of mutual respect and friendship. A beautiful origin story for a nation built on unity. This is the image that has been passed down through generations. Art, literature, and school plays have all reinforced this narrative. We see paintings like Jean Leon Garam Ferris's The First Thanksgiving 1621, which, while painted in the early 20th century, has defined our collective mental picture of the event. It's a scene of calm, order, and cooperation. The Pilgrims are depicted as pious and grateful hosts, and the Wampanoag people as noble and willing guests. This romanticized version is simple, it's comforting, and it's easy to digest. It tells a story of a peaceful beginning, of two cultures coming together to break bread in a spirit of gratitude. It's the version that makes for a great holiday special and a straightforward history lesson for kids. But history is rarely that simple or that neat. When we place the simplified story next to the complex truth, the picture starts to change dramatically. The reality of 1621 was far more complicated and fraught with tension, desperation, and political calculation than the rosy paintings suggest. First, let's consider the context. The Pilgrims, who had arrived on the Mayflower the year before, were in a desperate situation. That first winter was brutal. They were unprepared for the harsh New England climate, and disease and starvation wiped out about half of their original number. By the time of the 1621 harvest, their survival was anything but certain. They were on the brink. On the other side, you have the Wampanoag people, led by their Sachemequin, also known as Massasoit. The Wampanoag were not a monolithic group. They were a powerful confederation of tribes who had inhabited the land for thousands of years, and they had their own immense struggles. Just a few years before the Pilgrims arrived, from about 1616 to 1619, a devastating epidemic, likely brought by European traders, swept through the coastal native populations. It wiped out an estimated 75 to 90% of their people in some areas. Entire villages were left empty. This created a massive power vacuum and left them vulnerable to rival tribes like the Narragansett to the west. So when these two groups met, it wasn't just a friendly, spontaneous gathering. It was a strategic encounter driven by mutual need. The Pilgrims needed allies to survive and navigate this new world. Usimequin, leading a weakened Wampanoag Nation, saw a potential alliance with the English and their firearms as a way to protect his people from their rivals. The Wampanoag didn't just stumble upon the Pilgrims' feast. Historical accounts suggest that when the Pilgrims fired their muskets in celebration, Usimequin and about 90% of his men showed up, likely to investigate the commotion and assess the situation. They were unexactly invited in the way we might think of a dinner party invitation today. Their arrival, with 90 warriors, likely caused some alarm for the small group of about 50 surviving Pilgrims. But what followed was a diplomatic maneuver. The Wampanoag warriors went out and hunted 5 deer to contribute to the meal. And for 3 days, these two very different groups shared food and company. But it was less a party and more of a tense, calculated, and temporary truce. It was a political summit, born of desperation and strategic necessity on both sides. The simplified story erases this context. It glosses over the devastating plague that cleared the way for the Pilgrims' settlement at Bedtime, a former Wampanoag village. It ignores the complex political landscape and the very real fears and strategic motivations of both groups. The reality wasn't a fairy tale of instant friendship. It was a fragile, temporary alliance in a world of uncertainty and profound loss. So, how did this complex, tense, and strategic meeting transform into the simple, heartwarming myth we know today? How did Thanksgiving become such an integral part of the American identity? The journey from a 17th century harvest gathering to a national holiday is a long one, and it tells us more about the needs of a growing nation than it does about the actual events of 1621. For over 200 years after the event, this harvest meal was largely forgotten. It wasn't a major holiday. The real transformation began in the 19th century. As the United States was expanding westward and grappling with deep internal divisions, especially leading up to the Civil War, there was a growing need for a unifying national story and origin myth. Writers and historians in the 1840s and 50s rediscovered the story of the Pilgrims. They latched onto it as a perfect founding narrative. Here was a story of pious, hard-working colonists who, through faith and perseverance, made a new life in the wilderness. The peaceful feast with the Native Americans provided a comforting, sanitized beginning, one that conveniently overlooked the violent conflicts and land disputes that were happening in real time as the nation expanded. The key figure in cementing Thanksgiving as a national holiday was a magazine editor named Sarah Josepha Hawley. For decades, she campaigned tirelessly, writing editorials and sending letters to presidents, urging them to declare Thanksgiving a national holiday. She saw it as a way to unite the country, a great American festival that would bring families and the nation together. Finally, in 1863, in the midst of the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln issued a proclamation declaring the last Thursday in November as a national day of thanksgiving and praise. Lincoln's goal was explicit: to help heal a fractured nation. He called on Americans to remember their shared blessings, even in a time of immense suffering and division. The focus was on unity, family, and gratitude, two themes that resonated deeply with a war-torn country. It was in this moment that the myth truly took hold. Thanksgiving became a symbol of American resilience and moral virtue. The story of the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag, now heavily romanticized, served as the perfect backdrop. It presented an idealized vision of America's origins, one where different cultures could coexist peacefully, glossing over the much more violent and complicated reality of colonization that followed. It became a story America told itself about itself. A story of piety, harmony, and manifest destiny, all wrapped up in a holiday feast. As we move forward, it's crucial to hold both the myth and the memory. The myth tells us about the values America has aspired to: unity, gratitude, and community. But the memory, the complex and often painful history, reminds us of the reality. It challenges us to look beyond the simple narratives and understand the perspectives of everyone involved, especially the Wampanoag people, whose story has so often been silenced or simplified. Understanding this history doesn't mean we have to stop celebrating a day of gratitude with our loved ones, but it does mean we can do so with a more complete and honest understanding of its origins. It allows us to acknowledge the complexities and have more meaningful conversations about what it means to be an American and how our nation's story has been shaped. Thanks for joining me on this historical journey today. It's a complicated topic, but an important one. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that define us. See you next time. Hello, and welcome back to our journey through history. For the past 17 chapters, we've explored the complex, often difficult story of the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag. We've delved into historical records, examined different viewpoints, and tried to understand the events that shaped a nation. But history isn't just about what happened then. It's about how those events continue to resonate today. This final chapter isn't about looking back at the 17th century. It's It's about listening to the voices of the present. Today, we turn our attention to the Wampanoag people and how they remember this shared past. For many Americans, the story of the first Thanksgiving is a heartwarming tale of friendship and cooperation. It's a foundational myth, often simplified into a neat, happy narrative. But for the descendants of the Wampanoag, the story is far more complex, layered with pride, sorrow, and a profound sense of resilience. To understand their perspective is to understand that the past is never truly past. It lives on in cultural traditions, in family stories, and in the very land itself. Imagine growing up in a community where your ancestors are main characters in America's origin story, but the version everyone else knows is only a fraction of the truth. For the Wampanoag, there is immense pride in their heritage, pride in being the people of the first light, who have inhabited this land for over 12,000 years. Pride in their sophisticated systems of governance, their deep spiritual connection to the earth, and their ancestors' initial generosity and willingness to help the struggling English newcomers. They remember Massasoit Ausamequin, not just as a historical figure, but as a leader who made a difficult, strategic choice in a time of crisis, hoping to secure a future for his people. This pride is a powerful, living force, celebrated in their language, their art, their ceremonies, and their continued presence on their ancestral homelands. But alongside this pride, there is a deep and enduring sorrow. The Wampanoag remember what came after that first harvest feast. They remember the broken promises, the encroachment on their lands, the devastating impact of diseases, and the brutal conflict of King Philip's War, which decimated their population and tore their world apart. They remember the systematic efforts to erase their culture and language. This isn't ancient history for them. It's a collective trauma, a story of loss passed down through generations. The sorrow isn't about bitterness, but about acknowledging the profound human cost of colonization. It's about mourning the loss of people, of land, and of a way of life that was irrevocably altered. This mix of pride and sorrow is what makes the Wampanoag remembrance so powerful. It's not a simple story of victory. It's a story of survival, adaptation, and an unbroken chain of identity. They honor their ancestors, not just for their suffering, but for their strength, their intelligence, and their refusal to disappear. This remembrance is an active, ongoing process. It's about carrying the lessons of the past into the present and fighting for the future. It's about ensuring that the Wampanoag story, in all its complexity, is heard and respected. So, how does this remembrance take shape in the modern world? One of the most powerful and poignant examples happens every year in the very place where the Pilgrim story is most famously celebrated. Plymouth, while many families across America gather for a Thanksgiving feast, a different kind of gathering takes place on Coles Hill, overlooking Plymouth Rock. This is the National Day of Mourning. Since 1970, indigenous people and their allies have gathered on the fourth Thursday of November to commemorate this day. It was started by a Wampanoag man named Wamsuta, Frank James. He was invited to speak at a state dinner celebrating the 350th anniversary of the Pilgrim's Landing. When the event organizers saw his speech, which spoke truthfully about the disease, land theft, and conflict that followed the Pilgrims' arrival, they tried to censor it. They wanted him to read a revised, more positive version. Wamsuta refused. Instead of compromising his people's truth, he and others organized a protest, and the National Day of Mourning was born. This day is not a protest against giving thanks or being with family. It's a protest against the mythologizing of history and the erasure of indigenous people's experiences. It is a day of remembrance and spiritual connection, as well as a protest of the racism and oppression that indigenous peoples continue to experience worldwide. Participants speak about historical and ongoing injustices, honor their ancestors, and reaffirm their cultural survival. It is a solemn, powerful counter-narrative to the mainstream Thanksgiving holiday. It serves as a stark reminder that for the Wampanoag and many other native nations, this day is not one of celebration, but a reminder of the beginning of the end of their way of life. The National Day of Mourning challenges us all to think more deeply about what we're celebrating. It asks us to move beyond the cartoonish images of pilgrims and Indians, and to confront the uncomfortable truths of our shared history. It's a call for empathy and a more complete understanding. By acknowledging this day, we don't diminish the idea of gratitude. we enrich it by grounding it in historical honesty. It reminds us that for every story of arrival and settlement, there is another story of displacement and survival. The Wampanoag don't want to ruin anyone's holiday. They simply want the truth to be acknowledged. They want the world to remember that before there was a Thanksgiving feast, there was a thriving civilization, and that the descendants of that civilization are still here, still fighting for their rights, and still mourning their losses. As we conclude this series, we arrive at the most important point: the call to remember the real people behind the story. History is not a collection of dates and events. It's the collective story of human beings. The Pilgrims were real people, scared, hopeful, flawed, and determined. And the Wampanoag are real people, with rich families, complex societies, deep emotions, and an enduring culture. For too long, the story has been told in a way that flattens these individuals into symbols. Massasoit becomes a symbol of welcome, Squanto a symbol of help, and the anonymous Indians become a backdrop for the Pilgrim drama. This is a disservice to their memory and to our own understanding. We need to remember that these were men, women, and children. When we talk about the diseases that swept through Wampanoag villages, we must remember the parents who lost their children, the communities that lost their elders, their knowledge keepers, and their leaders. When we talk about King Philip's War, we must remember the terror, the grief, and the families torn apart on both sides of the conflict. The Wampanoag today are not relics of the past. They are teachers, artists, fishermen, scientists, and community leaders. They are living, breathing connections to this history. Organizations like the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe and the Wampanoag tribe of Gehedaquina are vibrant, modern sovereign nations working to preserve their language, protect their ancestral lands, and ensure a prosperous future for their children. Hearing their stories in their own words is essential. When you visit Plymouth, go beyond the Mayflower and Plymouth museums. Seek out the perspective of the Wampanoag. Learn about the National Day of Mourning. Read books, watch documentaries, and listen to podcasts created by Indigenous people. Support their artists and businesses. This isn't about assigning blame or feeling guilty about the past. It's about choosing to be more informed, more empathetic, and more honest. It's about seeing history not as a simple story with heroes and villains, but as a complex tapestry woven with threads of cooperation and conflict, of hope and of tragedy. The true spirit of that first harvest feast, if we are to find one, was about recognizing shared humanity in a moment of need. The greatest way we can honor that moment is by extending that same recognition to the descendants of the people who made it possible. We must remember the Wampanoag, not as they exist in a simplified myth, but as a resilient people with a past that deserves to be honored and a future that deserves to be supported. Thank you so much for joining me on this long and often challenging journey. I hope this series has given you a richer, more nuanced understanding of this pivotal moment in history. If you've found this content valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into the stories that shape our world. Thank you for watching. Good evening, and welcome back. Settle in, get comfortable, and let's journey together into the quiet corners of history. Tonight, we explore Chapter 19, Gratitude Beyond History. Have you ever stopped to think about the simple act of giving thanks? It feels so personal, so immediate, doesn't it? A thank you for a kind word, for a meal shared, for a moment of peace. But what if I told you that when you feel gratitude, you are part of an ancient, unbroken chain stretching back through all of human history? Imagine, for a moment, a world lit only by firelight and stars. A family gathers at the end of a long day. They might not have used the same words we do, but the feeling was there. Gratitude for the warmth of the fire, for the food they foraged, for the safety of being together as the darkness deepened outside their cave. That feeling, that deep, quiet sigh of contentment and thanks, is the same feeling that settles in your own heart today. This spirit of gratitude is a thread woven through every culture, every civilization, every faith. It transcends time. Think of the ancient Egyptians, giving thanks to the Nile for its life-giving flood, ensuring a bountiful harvest. Picture a Roman farmer, looking over his fields of golden wheat under a setting sun, his heart swelling with thanks for the soil and the rain. Hear the soft prayers of a medieval monk, grateful for a moment of quiet contemplation and the beauty of a hand-scribed manuscript. From the elaborate harvest festivals of the Incas in the Andes Mountains, to the simple, personal offerings of a Shinto priest in Japan, the ritual may change, but the core emotion remains identical. It's a fundamental human response to the goodness of life, no matter how small. It's the recognition that we have received something precious, whether it's from the earth, from another person, or from the great mystery of existence itself. This connection is profound. When you express gratitude, you are speaking a language understood by every ancestor who came before you. You are participating in a ritual as old as humanity itself. The feeling of thanks for a successful harvest thousands of years ago is the same feeling of thanks we have for a successful project at work. The gratitude for a safe return from a dangerous journey in a forgotten age mirrors our own relief and thanks when a loved one arrives home safely. The act of giving thanks is a bridge across centuries. It connects us to the farmer, the sailor, the artist, the mother, the father, all of whom have looked upon their lives and found reasons to be thankful. They worried. They struggled. They hoped. Who's us with and in their moments of peace, they, too, felt that quiet, powerful wave of gratitude wash over them. So, as we bring this chapter to a close, let's take a moment for reflection. Think about the peace of this quiet night. Think about the comfort of your bed, the roof over your head. In this moment of calm, feel that connection. You are part of a grand, timeless chorus of thanksgiving. The gratitude in your heart is an echo of gratitude felt for millennia. It's a beautiful thought, isn't it? That this simple, gentle emotion is one of the most powerful and enduring forces in human history. It reminds us that despite all our differences across time and space, we are all connected by our shared capacity for love, for hope, and for gratitude. Thank you for joining me on this peaceful journey tonight. I hope these thoughts bring you a sense of connection and tranquility as you drift off to sleep. If you enjoyed this reflection, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more chapters from our journey. May your rest be deep and your dreams be sweet. Good night. As our journey through time comes to a close, let the last rays of a Plymouth sunset wash over you. Here, in the quiet embrace of twilight, where the Atlantic whispers against the shore, the echoes of history are at their most profound. Can you hear them? The faint, resilient voices of the past, carried on the salty breeze voices of hope, of hardship, of a shared moment that would ripple through centuries. This is where our story ends, but also where it truly begins. We've walked the cobblestone paths, stood on the hallowed ground, and listened to the stories of two peoples meeting at a crossroads of destiny. The Pilgrims, driven by a fervent faith and a desperate need for a new beginning, and the Wampanoag, masters of this land, guided by tradition and an uncertain curiosity. Their encounter, culminating in that famed harvest feast of 1621, was never simple. It was a complex tapestry woven with threads of survival, diplomacy, and a fragile, fleeting moment of mutual understanding. Let's strip away the layers of myth, the paper turkeys and buckled hats of modern tradition, and look at the heart of that first Thanksgiving. It wasn't a proclamation or a holiday. It was a harvest festival, a spontaneous expression of relief after a brutal year. The Mayflower Compact had laid a foundation for self-governance, but it was the harsh reality of the New World that tested their resolve. Sickness and starvation had claimed half their number in that first unforgiving winter. The survivors who planted their meager crops did so with prayers on their lips and the memory of their fallen loved ones in their hearts. When the harvest finally came in, bountiful beyond their wildest hopes, their relief was immeasurable. The sound of their celebratory musket fire, a European tradition of rejoicing, was what first drew the attention of Massasoit, the great sachem of the Wampanoag. He didn't arrive as an invited guest to a pre-planned dinner. He arrived with 90% of his warriors, cautious and prepared to investigate the noise. What could have been a moment of conflict, another chapter in a story of misunderstanding, became something else entirely. Seeing the Pilgrims celebrating their survival, Massasoit and his people chose not to be adversaries, but to join them. They contributed to the feast, bringing 5 deer they had hunted, a generous offering that dwarfed the Pilgrims' own provisions. For 3 days, these two disparate groups, English settlers and Native Americans put aside their differences. They shared food, they competed in games, and they communicated through the indispensable Squanto, the bridge between their two worlds. This was the reality of that moment. It was not a naive portrait of perfect harmony, but a pragmatic and deeply human gathering. It was a moment of peace, born from mutual need. The Pilgrims needed the Wampanoag's knowledge to survive, and Massasoit, facing threats from rival tribes, saw a potential ally in these strange newcomers with their powerful muskets. Their alliance was a strategic one, yet for those 3 days, something more profound was shared. They saw each other not just as strangers, but as fellow inhabitants of the land, celebrating the earth's bounty together. As the sun sets on our story, we must carry this truth forward. The first Thanksgiving was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a far more complicated one. The peace of 1621 was tragically short-lived. As more colonists arrived, the balance of power shifted. Land disputes grew, and the spirit of cooperation frayed, eventually breaking in the fires of conflict like King Philip's War. The shared meal became a distant memory, overshadowed by decades of pain, loss, and misunderstanding. So why do we remember it? Why do we hold on to this single moment of light? Because it serves as a powerful lesson. It teaches us that peace is possible, that common ground can be found even in the most unlikely of circumstances. It reminds us that sharing a table is one of the most fundamental human acts of connection. In that act, we acknowledge our shared humanity, our shared reliance on the earth, and our shared hope for a better future. The legacy of Thanksgiving is therefore dual. It is a celebration of harvest, gratitude, and family, the warmth and joy we cherish today. But it is also a somber remembrance of a promise unfulfilled, a reminder of the complex and often painful history of this nation. To truly honor the spirit of that first gathering, we must acknowledge both. We must celebrate with gratitude, but also reflect with humility. Look once more as the final sliver of light disappears below the horizon over Plymouth Harbor. The air grows cooler. The stars begin to emerge, just as they did for the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag 400 years ago. Their voices may be soft now, but they haven't vanished. They echo in the rustling leaves, in the crashing waves, and in the quiet moments when we gather with those we love. They ask us to remember the whole story, the hope and the sorrow, the alliance and the conflict. The story of Thanksgiving is a story of America itself, a tale of beautiful beginnings, of tragic turns, and of an enduring hope that we can learn from our past to build a more inclusive and understanding future. It challenges us to look beyond our own tables and see the wider community, to extend a hand where there is need, and to listen to voices different from our own. In giving thanks, we remember the courage of those who crossed an ocean for a dream. We remember the generosity of the people who welcomed them to these shores. We remember the bounty of the harvest, a gift from the earth that sustains us all. But most importantly, we remember not just what was gained, but what was shared. In that sharing, however brief, lies the enduring light of Thanksgiving, a beacon of possibility, a lesson for all seasons, and a hope for all time. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through history. It has been an honor to share these stories with you. If you found this series meaningful, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more explorations into the past. Until next time, may your own gatherings be filled with gratitude, remembrance, and the spirit of sharing.